welcome back into the Norfolk Cottage garden, and we're going to do another major bed makeover this afternoon. This is the long border on the back of our south facing borders here. It's mainly roses and herbaceous shrubs, and by the end of September it's starting to look, well, pretty sad to be honest. We've neglected this most of the summer. This area here, particularly under this big oak tree, has been left for all these bluebells, which we showed you early in the season. This area is absolutely gorgeous in spring, but by this time it's full of weed because we've allowed all those bluebells to seed. They've all set seed now and the seed's been distributed, and what we're left with is various weeds coming up through this border. It's looking quite untidy. We've also got ivy starting to evade off the back bank, which we need to keep cut back, otherwise that will just take over, and if we were to allow that we wouldn't have any of these spring bulbs in this border. The main bit of soil is really quite full of grass and other pernicious weeds. We've got dock in here, nettle, ground elder, you name it, full house really. And what we're going to do now is go over this and try and remove the bulk of this and give it a top dressing to try and perk these plants up. Further down where the soil's a bit moister and more fertile, away from the cover of that big oak tree, situation's even worse. Look, we've got nettle, grass, this creeping sort of buttercup type weed that's quite invasive here. We've also got horsetail. There you go, that's a horsetail, which is almost impossible to dig out. You've just got a basically war of attrition on that one by cutting its heads off frequently throughout the season. And again, here in the back of the border I've got nettle, ivy invading in from the hedgerow, and bramble cascading down out of the hedge together with the ivy. So a big cutback job to try and get some soil exposed at the back of this border, and then we're going to try and remove as much as we possibly can of all this weed and then get a top dressing on as soon as possible. Now when we're doing this border we've got to be really careful because there are literally thousands of little spring bulbs, particularly tete-a-tete and February gold in here, and they're not that deep because they've been planted out of pots into the soil. They probably didn't go down the full 6 inches that they'd ideally like, so we can't use too many tools on this. We've got to use stuff that's superficial to try and break the surface structure up to loosen these weeds and get them out, rather than digging with a fork or spade. My two favourite tools for this job are these two. They're really old-fashioned. I don't know whether you can buy them anymore. You probably can't. This is an old draw hoe, and basically the technique with this is just to draw it across the surface just below the surface of the soil, just demonstrating that on the grass. But that is a lovely tool for just loosening stuff and starting to break the surface. And the other little tool I've got here, I think these were originally designed as moleing tools. Now by moleing I mean when you're going out and trying to catch moles. It's got a tiny little shovel on one end and a 4-prong, quite extensive sharp rake on the other. This goes into the soil, drags along. Just let me show you this. It just loosens things beautifully and allows you then to come in and lift your weed up. It loosens it, breaks the soil up around the roots, and makes pulling these weeds far more satisfying. You're more likely to get the whole root out, and if you can't, then you can turn this little tool round and just with things like this tree, oink it out. It's a nice sharp pointed tool, and if there are bulbs down there in that soil, you're not going to do too much collateral damage while you're doing it. The other tip we've got for this bit of border, where we're clearing, we know it's absolutely full of bulb seedlings and seed, so any grass that's being removed from here, that's just getting unceremoniously chucked around the base of this old apple tree into the wild area of grass around in this orchard. Now that carries all the little seedlings over, and this area again in spring is absolutely full of young bluebells and other bulb seedlings that have just been chucked over into that area. Works a treat. Here's a little tool in action. Loosens the roots beautifully, brings up even cooch. And if you get a deep dot like this one, then you've got a lovely sharp pointy tool, so you can get right down and get the whole thing out. I love this little tool. It's time to have a go at the ivy on this back border, and you can see where it's just growing forward from where it's been cut before, but also lower down. If I just get my little tool in there, you can see we've got some rooted bits coming up. You want to try and get as much of those out as possible. Sometimes this is really tough. A good pull and you'll get a good bit of root up. Best to try and get it all out with young oaks that have sprouted from last year. We want to try and stop this ivy from invading over into this border. So we're also, where it hasn't rooted in, just cutting back all this year's young stems to keep it in the base of the hedge. And we'll continue tidying all the way along here till we've got a nice clean edge with no invasion. Well, we've managed to complete at least the first part of this border, this area under the oak tree. We removed all the weed from it, and we've discovered quite a few little seedlings, including these ones around this plant, some of which are very close to the border and we're going to transplant. This is lovely in spring, looks nothing at the moment, it's really suffered from the drought. It's almost like a forget-me-not, perennial forget-me-not. I think it's some form of Lingularia, but I'll have to look it up. Don't actually know the formal name, but I've got half a dozen of these. So when I come to top dress this border, I'm going to be very careful not to cover up the ones that I've got in there and to transplant those to a new spot where I think they'll do very well next spring. I've also discovered a little area of these little beauties. These grow up to be a foliage plant that has lime green bracts and leaves in spring. It forms quite an ornamental plant. Here's the mother plant just further down the border. We're going to have to move some of these, but they're worth growing as structurally they overwinter beautifully, and as I say, give you a really striking colour in the foliage, almost as good as any spring bulb. So we want to see those spread out along this border. I've worked my way along as far as these roses, and I would normally be thinking about giving these a good prune back now structurally, taking out any dead wood. But look, they're going to have a beautiful crop of hips on these, and they're already colouring up. Beautiful orange. Now I think I'm going to leave these and see how they overwinter till the birds remove them, and then probably come back and prune these back in the spring rather than doing it now. Further down, the variety of roses in this border changes, mainly to, we think, Rosa de Reche. It's been here since before we bought this border. So initially these were all knocked back, it was just grassland here before we re-established. We didn't even realise this was a rose border. But Rosa de Reche hasn't set any hips and it's getting quite tall, so I am going to take the opportunity to give these quite a good haircut. But what we will do, even with the ones with hips in, is to look at them carefully and remove any dead or dying back material just to tidy these up, and that'll debulk them a little bit. I've still got plenty of work to do here on the actual border itself. You can see the ground elder just starting to emerge through there. We tend to leave things like foxgloves in situ because they do give you a beautiful display the following year, but the rest needs to come out. What you will have noticed on the bit that I've cleared, I'm not taking all this fibrous woody material or acorns away. I do tend to just cover this up and let it decompost and break down in situ. Acts as a good mulch and top dressing. Yes, we do get little oak trees coming up, but they're not a problem to pull, and they're not like sycamore seedlings that really drive you mad. The germination rate on these with the squirrels isn't that high. Most of them disappear. Hello, Poppy. Yes, alright. Time to get working. The apples on this apple tree down the end of the border, coming on a treat. Just look at the colour developing on that. For middle of September, these look as if they're properly ripening up, and they're big things as well. Just look at the size of that. They're still rock hard though. I'm going to keep an eye on these because it's easy to say to yourself these aren't going to be ready for picking till mid-October, and they can be left in situ only to come out and find them all on the ground. You can't assume that every year is going to be the same with things like this. So we'll keep a close eye on this crop, and if we see too many falling, we'll come and get the best ones and pop them into storage. Well, I've been going about 2 hours now, and I've made some serious inroads into these roses. The Rosa de Reche has really been cut hard back now, and it's looking a lot better and more open, this border, for it. I've left the mulch as it was left from last year, which is mainly wood chip, some leaf down and some acorns, and we're going to top dress this as well as further along later on. But that really is starting to open up this border, and I'm going to recover the edging and just trench down a little bit there to give us a nice edge to keep this border looking tidy until the spring, when all the bulbs start coming up again in it. But it's starting to look cared for again rather than unkempt, and a bit of bare soil with a bit of top dressing on will still be attractive rather than the bit I've still got to do. Yes, a lot of work yet to complete on this border, but in the back there we have got some rather nice tall white aster which is just about to start. A little bit of blue on the back, so by cutting the stuff back in front of it I'm actually going to get a little splash of colour back in this border. But there's still buddleia and rose and all sorts, as well as an awful lot of holly, ivy and bramble to come out. So I think I am going to have another 3 or 4 hours work and a good 5 or 6 of these to remove to get it all looking this good. So I'll push on and hang around for the end result. Just before I go and empty my barrow, I'm just going to show you this tree peony. This is quite a well established tree peony, and it's got some seed pods on it which you may not have seen before. Here we go. They're large things, you can't miss them when they form, and tree peonies do seed quite well. This one's got a real good crop of seeds coming on, and just down there you'll see a couple, actually 2 little tree peonies there which can be transplanted and put into a new position. If I have a look under this plant, there's actually 1, 2, third one coming up right down at the base of this plant. So it is worthwhile just leaving these pods on and letting them seed, and then sharing your young tree peonies with people that might be interested in growing them. Well, we've been working away at this border now for 2 sessions over a couple of days. It's been quite a nice time just doing it very slowly and gently without breaking my back. But I'm very pleased with the progress that we have made in here. We've cut a lot of stuff quite hard back. This is the big patch of Egyptian iris which was desperately in need of cutting back. What we've discovered in here is you can see it's dying out from the centres. Each rosette where an original plant was planted tends to proliferate outwards, and then you get a dead centre. So this is very much ready for digging up and splitting, and I'm going to take the opportunity to take that into a few new areas in this border, particularly further along. We've got a few nice things that we've found as well in the back of the borders. This little powder blue aster, come down you might get a better impression of the colour. Hidden away completely at the back, planted behind much taller things, but now we've done the cut back, that's hopefully going to get a chance to get going. To its side is the much bigger white flowered aster, which is much later and is only just showing a little bit of white colour in the buds. This little magnolia stellata again was almost completely hidden behind the iris clump, but it's growing away nicely and that's getting some size now. I have to get to a critical size to get their heads into the light here, and at that stage they just romp away. We've also got this lovely little hip grey leaf rose at the back, and a couple of small leaf rhododendrons which were bought as tiny little plants and put in 3 or 4 years ago. I have probably planted about 15 or 20 along here. Most have died and we've lost them, but I've got half a dozen now that are getting to a decent size and will give us some show next year. On the negatives, we've discovered we've got red ants in this border, which is a real downer. Don't mind the black ants, but the red ants, if they get hold of you, they really do give you a nasty sting. I haven't had them in this border before. Have had them in the courtyard at the front of the house, so they've probably been brought round here with something that's been in a pot or something, and transplanted in. So we do want to try and get rid of those before they get a grip, because if they do get going in this border, then we'll have colonies all over it, and it makes working on the border almost impossible. As soon as you see that, you have to move away and let them settle. So a few negatives, lots of positives. Border's looking very nice and tidy now. Generally we've got the edge back quite nicely. I've got a little area along there just under the oak tree where I've got to re-edge it. We dug out some bluebells from the path and hoped the grass would re-establish itself during the year. It hasn't done, so I'm going to do a back infill on that edge just to get a nice straight edge for my mowing. We've got half a dozen little oak trees out of this border as well, which I'm going to pot up. That's going to go probably into pots for 2 or 3 years. We should all be planting trees, everybody's saying, so I'm actually going to do it and grow some of these English oaks on and put them across the way in the 10-acre paddock into the fence. Hopefully they'll be there long after I've passed this garden on to somebody else. But now it's time to get the top dressing onto this. So that's my final task. I don't think I'm going to attempt it today, but if I do get it done over the next week or so, we'll give you a brief visit back to this border, showing it ready for the winter.